In June 1988, two American Chinook helicopters raced hundreds of miles across the Sahara Desert to recover an abandoned Soviet attack helicopter. The helicopter was a MiL Mi-24, known to NATO as the Hind. It had been operated by Libya and abandoned in northern Chad following the collapse of Libyan military positions during the conflict between the two countries. For the United States, the aircraft represented an opportunity to get hands-on with the Soviet Union's most capable attack helicopter, capable of both troop deployment and heavily armed close air support. The Americans had never possessed an intact operational example for detailed evaluation, instead relying on reports of experiences in the Afghanistan campaign over the previous decade or so, and the steady stream of human intelligence to drip out of the Soviet sphere. With the opportunity to study a Hind closely too good to pass up, the United States would plan and launch Operation Mount Hope III to get their hands on it. To understand Mount Hope III, we have to begin with the conflict between Libya and Chad. Chad had gained independence from France in 1960, but the country experienced years of political instability and civil conflict. To the north lay Libya, ruled by Muammar Gaddafi following his 1969 coup. One of the major points of contention between the two countries was the Aouzou Strip, a large area of northern Chad along the Libyan border. Libya claimed the territory, while Chad disputed the claim, with this dispute eventually manifesting into a series of military confrontations beginning in 1983, which, like the majority of worldwide conflicts throughout that time, would grow into something broader and connected to the wider Cold War. In its early years, Libya had actually received decent armament supplies from the United States, its Air Force equipped with F-5 Freedom fighters to provide its first real air combat capability. As was a theme of the time, regime change in Libya would signal a change in alliances, with Libya developing closer ties to the Soviet Union following Gaddafi's 1969 coup. This was a slow growth, with Libya steadily weaning itself off the US and initially finding support in France, who eagerly sold 110 Mirage 5s to the new regime. It was only in 1973 that Soviet armaments would start flooding in. As the Libyan Air Force grew into one of the largest in the world, bolstering its ranks with the era-appropriate MiG-25s, 23s, 21s, and even a large arsenal of Tu-22 bombers, the United States and France had steadily been providing arms to Chad, with France maintaining an active military presence of 2,400 personnel as part of Operation Epervier in response to the initial Libyan invasion. In their usual spirit of arming both sides, the French had continued their business with Libya throughout the build-up of the Chadian conflict, with dozens of Mirage F-1s finding their way to the Libyan Air Force in the mid-70s. The fighting reached its climax in 1986 and 87. Chadian forces, making extensive use of highly mobile Toyota pickup trucks equipped with heavy weapons, proved surprisingly effective against the larger and better-equipped Libyan force, the popularity of the technicals earning the conflict its name of the Toyota War. By 1987, Chadian forces had driven the Libyans back towards the border and captured several important military installations. So successful had been their resistance that Ronald Reagan, the US president at the time, considered using Habré, the Chadian leader at the time, and his forces to fully overthrow the Libyan government and replace Gaddafi, pledging a further $32 million in ongoing support. And yes, as I'm sure you're wondering, Habré was a great dude, real stand-up guy. In May 2016, he was found guilty of human rights abuses, including slavery, YouTube-unfriendly sexual acts, and ordering the killing of 40,000 people by an international tribunal in Senegal. He actually died of COVID-19 a few years ago. So yeah, there's that segue. Anyway, one of the military facilities captured during the Toyota War was the Libyan airfield at Wadi Doum in northern Chad. When the Libyans withdrew, they left behind large quantities of military equipment. Amongst it, of course, was an Mi-24. As we've already touched on, the Mi-24 was an unusual aircraft and somewhat unique in its capabilities. It had been developed in the Soviet Union during the 1960s and entered service in the early 70s, and it combined a heavily armed attack helicopter with a relatively large cabin capable of carrying troops. That uniqueness coming from the fact that helicopters are generally either-or. The aircraft was heavily armed, fast for a helicopter, and capable of carrying rockets, cannons, and even bombs, something explored far more in Soviet designs than Western ones. By the 1980s, the Hind was not just one of the most recognizable Soviet helicopters, but proven combat capable, having fought across the Middle Eastern theatres of the period. It was also incredibly numerous, with close to 3,000 built today. At the time, hundreds were in service across the Soviet inventory and those of their satellite states. It would be an inevitable opponent in the event of any conflict with the West. This meant it was crucial for the West to better understand the aircraft, not just from the limited technical view available, but its actual performance. What were its flight characteristics like? How did its sensors work, both offensively and defensively? And most importantly, how best to combat it? The most useful way of answering those questions was to examine an actual aircraft. The United States had previously attempted to recover an Mi-24 from Chad. That attempt had not produced an intact flyable aircraft, because the helicopter had to be dismantled and transported overland by truck, in such a manner that it would never fly again. The newly discovered Hind at Wadi Dum presented a much better opportunity. It was largely intact and could potentially be moved by air. After negotiations involving the United States, Chad, and France, permission was obtained for the Americans to recover the helicopter, costing them $2 million and a crate of Stinger missiles for the permission. The mission was assigned to the US Army's 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, and the aircraft chosen an MH-47 Chinook. This was a specialized version of the CH-47 designed for long-range special operations. The main problem was that the Hind was extremely heavy. A normal Chinook could lift substantial loads, regularly slinging artillery pieces or smaller vehicles across battlefields, but the combination of the helicopter's weight, the distance involved, the heat of the Sahara, and the need to carry enough fuel made the mission particularly demanding. So the 160th began testing the concept. In April 1988, two MH-47Ds were transported by C-5 Galaxy to the White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico. There, the crews simulated the weight of the Hind using 6 large water containers suspended beneath one of the Chinooks. The crews then conducted night flights over the desert and practiced quick turnarounds, refueling with C-130 aircraft on makeshift airstrips, simulating the stops they'd need to make on the way back with the captured Hind. The rehearsals were considered successful, and the mission received its execution order on the 21st of May, 1988. The operation was deliberately kept secret. Libyan forces were known to still be in the area in small pockets, and their air force had carried out several days of bombing against the airfield following the withdrawal under the orders of the Soviet Union, who feared any abandoned equipment falling into enemy hands. Where's that foreshadowing guy? An advance party travelled ahead to Chad and began preparing for the arrival of the main force. In June, the two MH-47Ds were dismantled and loaded aboard a US Air Force C-5 Galaxy, along with more than 60 personnel that would support the operation. The C-5 flew directly to N'Djamena, the capital of Chad. Once there, the Chinooks were removed from the transport aircraft and reassembled, with any unnecessary items removed to save weight. They were also fitted with additional tanks in the cargo area that held an extra 600 gallons of fuel. These gave the helicopters enough fuel to make the long flight north to Wadi Dum without stopping. The plan itself was actually quite straightforward. 2 Chinooks would leave N'Djamena during the night. They would fly approximately 550 miles north to Wadi Dum, where the Hind would already have been prepared for lifting by an advance team. 1 Chinook would attach the helicopter as a sling load, with its partner there for any contingency. The 2 aircraft would then return south, making 2 refueling stops before reaching N'Djamena. At midnight on the 11th of June 1988, the 2 MH-47s departed N'Djamena. In spite of the challenge of the desert flight, with the fuel situation somewhat ropey and navigation a challenge against the black backdrop of the seemingly endless desert, they met the advance team at the airfield having encountered no issues. The Hind was in surprisingly good condition, and consideration had been given to simply flying it out. It had, however, suffered damage to one of its engines, with a single bullet having struck its left engine at some point. The crews landed their MH-47s near the aircraft. The additional fuel tanks were hastily removed because the Chinooks would need all their lifting capacity for the Hind. Once everything was secured, the first Chinook slowly lifted the Mi-24 from the ground. The load was stable. The Hind was now hanging beneath the Chinook. The 2 aircraft began the return journey. There was no firefight. No Libyan aircraft appeared. The recovery was, in that respect, remarkably uneventful. But the mission was still far from finished. Multiple refuelings and another dart across the barren desert still to come. Because the additional fuel tanks had been discarded, the Chinooks could not fly directly back to N'Djamena. Their first stop was Faya Largeau, A US Air Force C-130 had established a temporary refueling point there, just as they had practiced in the desert in the months before. The Chinook, carrying the Hind, had to set the helicopter down, then itself, in order to refuel. There was a problem when the C-130's refueling system malfunctioned. Rather than abandon the schedule, members of the 160th worked with the Air Force crew to get the system functioning again. The Hind was then lifted again, and the two Chinooks continued further south. Their second refueling point was Musoro, where French Foreign Legion personnel were waiting. As we've mentioned, the French were already heavily involved in supporting Chad and were aware of the operation. As part of the negotiations for the operation's approval, they'd even received a badly damaged Hind for themselves that had been shot down earlier in the conflict. In the same way that the intelligence on the Hind was valuable to the Americans, it held just as much value to their European allies. In addition to refueling, they were providing further support in the form of Mirage F-1s on top cover. The Hind was again placed on the ground while the Chinooks refueled. After this second stop, the helicopters began the final leg towards N'Djamena. The final stage of the flight produced the most serious problem of the mission. The temperature was around 110 degrees Fahrenheit, pushing the engines on the heavily laden Chinook to the limit. Then, approximately 45 minutes from N'Djamena, the crew encountered a major sandstorm. The storm formed a wall of dust thousands of feet high. Visibility rapidly deteriorated. The two Chinooks separated from one another and slowed down, no longer able to maintain visual contact. The Chinook carrying the Hind eventually emerged from a sandstorm and saw N'Djamena ahead. The crew had only a limited amount of time before the storm caught them again. They put the Hind down on the airfield and landed behind it. The second Chinook emerged shortly afterwards and also landed. For roughly 20 minutes, the crews remained inside their aircraft while the storm passed over the airfield, battering them. The wind was strong enough to move equipment around the base, and sand was driven into virtually every exposed part of the Chinooks, but the aircraft and crews had made it back. The Hind was then prepared for shipment to the United States, along with the Chinooks themselves that would be making their return journey. The operation had required the aircraft to be dismantled, transported to Chad, reassembled, flown across the desert, and then dismantled again. The Hind was loaded aboard a C-5 Galaxy and transported back to the United States. It eventually reached Fort Rucker, Alabama, where it underwent an initial technical examination and was restored to flying condition. Whilst the men of the 160th rightly celebrated a successful and excellently executed operation, the real value of Mount Hope 3 came with the Hind's arrival in the US. It was studied extensively, with American personnel now able to examine the aircraft's construction, systems, weapons, and performance directly. It was also used in training. The helicopter became part of the Army's Threat System Management Office, where it could be flown against American forces during exercises. Rather than relying entirely on descriptions or captured technical information, American pilots could see how an actual Hind behaved. Air defense crews could also train against a genuine Soviet-designed aircraft. This was particularly useful during the final years of the Cold War, when understanding Soviet equipment remained an important military priority, as military planners recognized the reality that future conflicts against lower-tier forces would continue to see adversary forces fielding swathes of former Soviet equipment. For the 160th Special Operations Aviation Group, Mount Hope 3 was significant for another reason. The operation demonstrated what its specialized Chinooks could accomplish. The aircraft had been designed and modified for long-range special operations, but the mission showed that they could also perform heavy lift work over enormous distances in arguably the most challenging conditions they would be asked to face. Two MH-47s have flown deep into the Sahara at night, recovered a large enemy aircraft and returned safely, and all accomplished without firing a shot. Eventually, as the aircraft aged and maintaining airworthiness became a battle, the US Army considered scrapping it. Fortunately for us all, it was instead preserved, and today the very Hind recovered from Operation Mount Hope 3 is displayed at the Southern Museum of Flight in Birmingham, Alabama. I guess you could say, in hindsight, the operation was very successful.